News Talk is online. News Talk Online, a production of Paltalk.com, syndicated by CRN Digital Talk Radio, and hosted all over the place. Please go to reportergary.com early and often, like voting in Chicago, for stories that you may or may not see, hear, or read in the mainstream media. That's where the Paltalk News Network website resides. Yes, for those of you watching me on cam, I've got my snowman mug. I'm drinking hot chocolate in solidarity with my brothers and sisters in the Midwest who have 2 feet of snow heading their way, something that will be all over tomorrow, I am sure. In Australia, where they are still mopping up from flooding that covered an area as large as Germany and France combined, a cyclone is bearing down. A massive cyclone, Rod. Tell me what you guys are battening down the hatches and awaiting.
Well, it certainly is, Gary. It's expected to bring winds of 280 kilometres an hour, just what Queensland doesn't want after the floods that they've had. They're still cleaning up for there, and in fact the flood waters are still abating. So, yeah, it hadn't been made a Category 5 yet, but it's expected to. This is going to hit just a little higher than where the floods were, so what part of Australia wasn't wet before is certainly going to be wet now. It has the potential to be the biggest ever at this stage, so residents are really battening down and, well, just trying to protect themselves as much as they can. Wednesday night it's expected to hit land, and we're just hoping that it will drop it a little bit as it gets closer, but it doesn't look that way, I'm afraid.
Well, I know you're going to stay on top of this, and I know not only is it going to cause some personal problems for a lot of people who are already suffering from the flooding there in Australia, but I know it's going to cause a tremendous strain on the budget there in Oz, and we will be with you as you track it in the ensuing days, Rod, and we appreciate you being our eyes and ears there in Australia on all things that are happening there. I want to switch now to Egypt very quickly because that is the story of the day still, and that has to do with, of course, the evolving events in Egypt, but I want to put a little bit more perspective on it. In the past 7 days, we've been speaking to you mainly about how things are taking place in terms of our breaking news coverage in Egypt. But I'd like to take some time right now to explore what U.S. policy has been in the 30 years of the Mubarak regime and how that diplomatic policy set things up for what we are suffering through today. And in a more macro view, maybe take a few minutes to look at how our U.S. policy diplomatically is actually contradictory. Because in some cases we say we support democracy wherever it may flourish around the world, but on the other hand we only support democracies that support our interests. And if a regime such as that in Egypt supports U.S. interests, then we support it or at least tolerate it. That's my perspective, but I'm not an expert, but Robert Naiman is, N-A-I-M-A-N. He is policy director at Just Foreign Policy, edits the Just Foreign Policy Daily News Summary, and writes on U.S. foreign policy at Huffington Post. Robert Naiman, welcome to News Talk Online on the Paltalk News Network.
It's good to be with you.
It's great to have you with us. So let's go back to my first question, if we might, Robert Naiman. I'd like your perspective on how U.S. policy enabled, basically, Hosni Mubarak over the past 30 years to run a corrupt government and abuse people that he was, well, elected, appointed to serve, and how we allow for that in terms of our foreign policy, in terms of the monies that we give them. We give Egypt a lot of money to keep this regime propped up.
That's certainly true, and have given them billions, given the government billions in U.S. aid, overwhelmingly military aid, over the course of the last 30 years. And it's perceived in Egypt that the U.S. has supported Mubarak during this time, that the stability, quote-unquote stability of the Egyptian government has been substantially a result of U.S. government policy. And of course now in the last week, this question has very much come to the fore. You know, we saw just over the past week, it's been thrown into sharp relief as Vice President Biden and Secretary of Clinton earlier in the week said, you know, the Egyptian government is stable. Biden said Mubarak's not a dictator. These statements have been interpreted in Egypt as U.S. support for the Mubarak regime, for maintaining the Mubarak regime, and that has confirmed, in the perception of people there, you know, the belief of many about what was happening all along, that you know, never mind the rhetoric about democracy and human rights, U.S. was maintaining this government in power because it served, you know, quote-unquote U.S. interest as perceived by people in Washington. Not necessarily the interest of the majority of Americans, but interests of the people running U.S. policy.
Well, there are two areas, I'm sure, that the U.S. policymakers are most concerned about. One is control of the Suez Canal. The other is the Sinai and the relationship between Egypt and Israel. And for sure, the United States government had to have been concerned that the Muslim Brotherhood would take over if there were not a strong dictator like Mubarak. And both of those areas would fall into fundamentalist hands, and that clearly would not have been something that the United States would want. But in the meantime, we allowed for the trampling on the rights of the very people who we see today out in the street, demanding the freedoms that the rest of us enjoy.
Yeah, you know, I think it's important to keep in mind there's a tendency, people who want the U.S. to adopt a particular policy will tend to exaggerate the threat of the U.S. not adopting that policy. So, of course, you know, if you're Hosni Mubarak, you want the U.S. to think, you know, if not me, then chaos and disaster. So it's in the interest of Hosni Mubarak and his people to have people in the U.S. think that the alternatives are, you know, it's either me or the Muslim Brotherhood and chaos. And domestically, that's the same message that the Egyptian government gave to the Egyptian people. Oh, well, you know, if it's not us, it's the Muslim Brotherhood, and so you have to accept that there's a police state. And you know, we have to interrogate this. You know, is it really true that the only alternatives in Egypt are Hosni Mubarak and the Muslim Brotherhood? Is it really true that if the Muslim Brotherhood is allowed to participate in power in Egypt, it would necessarily be the case that the peace treaty with Israel would be torn up? I think there's a lot of reasons to think that both of those things are not true. The Muslim Brotherhood is part of the Egyptian opposition. They're Egyptians. The Egyptian government has engaged in a selective repression over the years. They've repressed the Muslim Brotherhood, and then they've allowed the Muslim Brotherhood, and they've repressed others even more. So to some extent, the relative weight, we won't really know until there's a real democracy in Egypt, you know, what percentage of the Egyptian population supports the Muslim Brotherhood as opposed to other parties that would be allowed to participate. But there's some reason to believe that in a sense the Muslim Brotherhood has benefited from this selective repression, that their relative weight in the organized opposition has been greater because of this selective repression, in part because, you know, they actually serve the usefulness to the Mubarak regime of being this threat that you could always invoke. And of course, also it's true that in a police state in a Muslim country, you know, you still can't close the mosque. So that gives, you know, an atmosphere of repression that actually gives kind of a comparative advantage to an organization that is is religiously based. But on the other hand, let's look at some of the other evidence. First of all, we have these, what is everybody looking at in the streets in the last week? See all these protesters. They're not carrying, religious slogans. They're carrying demands for democracy and free and fair elections. The Muslim Brotherhood in the last several days has been indicating that its priority is the establishment of pluralistic democracy. They're part of an opposition coalition that is led by Mohammed al-Baradei, the former director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, somebody well known to the U.S., former official of the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, and this opposition coalition, which includes secular parties, includes the Muslim Brotherhood, they've united, and they've been united for some time around this demand for democracy and free and fair elections. And actually, these leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood have been quoted in the New York Times in the past couple of days saying, we're cooperating with everyone, we're trying to establish democracy, we understand that there are these, fears of the Islamists in the U.S. and in the West, and we're not trying to lead here. We're just trying to cooperate with everyone else in establishing a democracy. Now, you could say, people will say, oh, well, they say that now, what is going to happen in the future? Well, that's something that you test with diplomacy. I mean, these people are coming and saying we're ready to negotiate. Where's the Egyptian government? Where's the U.S. in responding to this initiative for negotiations?
It's amazing to me, given your analyses, that the Egyptian people are a little bit irritated with the United States for propping up this regime as long as we have, and when they are being dispersed by tear gas canisters that say "Made in USA." I can't go to Walmart and buy anything that says "Made in USA," so I find that a bit ironic that we're not seeing anti-American slogans. And I think the fact that we are not really speaks to how focused these demonstrators are on the matter at hand. And while there are some comparisons that are being made to what happened at the time of the overthrow of the Shah, I find this a marked contrast to those events that occurred then.
Well, I think it's really key to understand that there is this broad-based movement that has come together around the demands for democracy and for free and fair election, and trying not to let anything else interfere with that. Any other issues come in or interfere with that, and I think they're also, explicitly trying to appeal to anyone who think that they might support that, including the Egyptian military. They're explicitly appealing to the Egyptian military to support their demands. We just had this announcement this morning, the Egyptian military saying, we will not fire on peaceful protesters. And they're also, I think, trying to appeal to people in the United States and the U.S. government, which they perceive as a key player in pushing the Mubarak regime to step down and support their demands for democracy.
This is Robert Naiman. He is the policy director at Just Foreign Policy, edits the Just Foreign Policy Daily News Summary, and writes on U.S. foreign policy at the Huffington Post. He's been busy writing every day, all day long, and we appreciate you, Robert, spending a few moments with us here on News Talk Online on the Paltalk News Network.